Firstly, thank you, Avi. Thank you, Sina. Thank you again to the Habura. Like you said, everything that was said, needed to be said was said last week, but the thank yous are always in place. I again want to give a special shout out to Rabbi Halevy, who helped me put together the source sheet as far as the formatting and making sure that everything's on the right page, things match up. So I want to give you a shout out again. And it's really good to see some new faces, definitely some old. So I'm really excited to be learning again together. Last week, we focused on what we call macro, which is really big, okay? We took social welfare and talked about, well, whose responsibility is it? Is it yours? Is it mine? Is it combined? Is it the government? It was a really big picture. What I want us to do today is focus in. We're going to go into a very specific issue, a very specific category, and very quickly realize that our Chachamim have things to say not just about big issues, blatant issues, but also the very small details, the very unique populations that exist within much larger picture. It'll be a little bit of a comparative analysis. I hope that anything I say or do is not offensive as much as bringing the facts and then letting you make educated decisions. So if you look at the top of the page, today's topic is youth at risk, a balanced solution to a common problem. In the writings of Rabbi Yosef Qafih or Kapach, I'm going to use the word Kapach, though I know that academically and probably more correctly it would be Qafih, about youth at risk. So let's start with from the beginning. By show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Erickson? Awesome. Okay, so let's start. Erickson is a theorist, a primary theorist in psychology and then obviously mental health and social work. A little bit of his history. So Erickson was born to a Danish Jewish mom who, while her husband was away, conceived a child with a non-Jewish Danish dad. Eventually she gets divorced. They move down to Germany. And in Germany, Eric, as a young kid, gets very, very sick. So at 3 years old, he's treated by a doctor. The doctor's name is Dr. Hamburger. Dr. Hamburger is Jewish. And his mother eventually marries Dr. Hamburger. Eric takes on the last name, so he's known as Eric Hamburger, and it's only much later on in life does he figure out that he's not quite a Hamburger, nor is he a Solemson. He grows up in a very turbulent time, okay? Think about at age 13, World War I is taking place. His family eventually makes it to Vienna, ultimately World War II, and he ends up in the United States. He always says that he struggled tremendously with his identity. When he would go to temple, right, his family would come to the temple, they would pray, and everybody would always make fun of him because he was tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and say, you look so Nordic. And then he would go to regular school during the week and say, oh my gosh, you look so Jewish. And in Hebrew we say, Yatzak kereach mishnei atzadim, right? He didn't fit in anywhere. I think this is eventually what inspires his actual work, his writings on identity, on figuring out who you are. He is an artist. He's somebody who does not excel at school at all. He doesn't fit into the narrow box and ultimately drops out. Later on in his life, in his 20s, he's called to a nice retreat at a Rosenfeld Center. If you haven't picked up on, it's also a Jewish center. And he was there to take care of the children while the parents were going through psychoanalysis by Anna Freud, so the daughter of Sigmund Freud. Anna Freud was observing him with the kids. And one day, 2 days, he's patient, he's teaching them. And she approached him and says, you're in the wrong field. You need to go into the field of human behavior and take care of children. And that's really when he takes a turn. He ends up signing up for the Academy of Freudian Psychology. Though he doesn't agree with everything that Freud says, or I should say necessarily doesn't agree, he ended up becoming a very big theorist. So here you have his theory on what we call psychosocial development, how human behavior develops based on their life cycles. If you look at the graph for a minute, you'll see it's divided up into originally eight different stages of life, where his whole theory is at every stage there's an identity crisis. There's something that needs to take place so that either the individual will progress to stage 2 successfully or they're going to stay stuck. I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a game, I think they're called Jenga blocks or Jenja blocks, but I think it's Jenga blocks, where you have to build, right? It's a bunch of nice little squares of blocks, but you got to build them straight. And if the foundation isn't straight, very likely you're not going to get very far. So I want to look at, for example, if you look at the top left of the graph picture, it says infancy. So infancy is age 0 to 18 months. At this age, what the child's crisis is Am I going to learn to trust people, or am I very quickly going to learn to mistrust human beings? Now, obviously, at this stage, it's imperative on the caretakers to respond when the child cries, when the child has needs. If the children, the infant, feels that they are being heard, that they are being taken care of, they're being protected, they will successfully learn to trust people. Unfortunately, there are many people who are in their 70s are still dealing with trust issues because they haven't been taken care of, right? So these are building blocks. It's interesting, at the end of Eric's life, he ends up moving to Boston and he became the first psychoanalyst there. He changed his last name. So from Hamburger, Eric became Eric Erickson, ultimately converts to Christianity and is buried in a Christian cemetery. His daughter said that for him, his inner turmoil of identity was finally settled once he changed his last name and really took on a new identity. If you move across the diagram, if you have it in color, it'll be the light blue. If you don't, it just says adolescence. So adolescence is the age that we would normally say between 12 and 18. And the struggle at this age is identity versus role confusion. How many of you have ever met teenagers? Right? I love you, I hate you, I'm so independent, you don't know me, can I have your credit card, I'm moving out forever, whoops, I came back 5 seconds later. There's a tremendous amount of confusion. Who am I in relation to my parents? Right? Very often I'll have parents who come and say, I don't understand what happened. My 11-year-old was like a rock star. They listened to everything I said. They loved me. They were like our representative of the family. The kid's now 13. Everything I say, they have to say the opposite. Everything I do is somehow wrong. They're somehow critical. I believe it was Mark Twain who once said that when he was 17, he couldn't understand why God had given him the most stupid parents in the world. And then yet when he turned 19, he couldn't figure out how in just 2 years they had become so smart, right? This is a very normal stage of life where people are trying to figure out, well, who am I? And part of figuring out who am I is, I don't accept everything that you throw at me. Just because you've told me up until now, this is who I am, this is what I am, this is what I believe, said who? Now this is actually a very healthy transition. And we hope that at the end, we get to a place of identity. Right? Hopefully by the time the kid hits 18, they know who they are, they know what they want to do, they know what their careers look like. We have something interesting, which is in the 1960s, there are a couple of revolutions taking place socially. Many of them are focused in the United States, but not only. Where there are 4 basic revolutions that shift really the progress of development. And we have somebody by the name of Joseph Arnett, who is actually still alive today, who adds to this theory. He said, you know what, it used to be age 18, that's it. You graduated, you went to work, you got married. That doesn't happen. I don't know about you, but I know 40-year-olds who are still sitting in their parents' basement playing video games. I meet 50-year-olds who are like, you know, I'm not sure that I want to do this. You're halfway through. You're not sure you want to do this career. And Arnett says, no, we have to put another stage in between adolescence and young adulthood. And he calls it emerging adolescence. So emerging adolescence is, there's no abrupt transition. It's a slow transition that goes way past years 18, stretching into 29, 30, 31, where, well, people are starting to do things at a much earlier age. For example, 10, 11, 12-year-olds in the United States are already having sex ed classes because they need it. Or they're having it because they're heavily involved. You also have the responsibility that normally came with adulthood is stretching further. So really on both ends, this middle chaotic years are stretching. With, for example, you'll find people who are in their 20s, barely finishing their BA, master's, maybe PhD. People are getting married less. People are moving out less. People are settling into what we would consider normal adulthood much later on. So in essence, this transition of youth, when we talk about youth at risk, very often will not be the stereotypical 15-year-old, 16-year-old. You may find 29-year-olds, 30-year-olds who are still experiencing the same struggles that we find in the youth. Now, I want to just share with you, so who are we talking about when we talk about demographics? Who's part of this population? So we have about 1.2 billion individuals who are between ages 12 and 19 in the world, which makes it about 16%. And then we have in the young adulthood category from 18 to 29, another 1.8 billion, which brings us to about 32% of the population. So when we're having a conversation about at-risk individuals, we're really talking about a significant chunk of the world, 32%. We're talking about almost 3 billion individuals who fit into this category. Now I want to share with you a minute. Okay, so what about the youth? What happens during this time period? What are we so concerned about? So if you look at source number 1, the World Health Organization, some fact sheets, it should actually say from June 8th, 2020, not July 8th, 2020. That is my error. I want to read to you some key facts you don't have and then look at our sheet. So we have that youth violence is a global public health problem. It includes a range of acts from bullying and physical fighting to more severe sexual and physical assault to homicide, which is murder. Worldwide, listen to this number, worldwide, some 200,000 homicides occur among youth aged 10 to 29. So notice they've already extended the youth. Each year, which is 42% of total number of homicides globally each year. That means from all the categories of people who are being killed, we have a significant sum, 200,000, 42% from the youth. For each young person killed, many more sustain injuries requiring hospital treatment. In one study, from 3 to 24% of women report that their first sexual experience was forced. When it is not fatal, youth violence has a serious, often lifelong impact on a person's physical, psychological, and social functioning. So we're talking about very serious issues that come up during these years. Now, I want to talk to you about 3 different categories of what creates risk. So obviously there's going to be individual, which is what a person is, their family, and then community. And then obviously we're going to try to figure out, well, where can we make a difference? And sometimes it'll be in all 3, and sometimes it'll be in 1, but definitely not none. So if you look at source 1, here are some risk factors within the individual group. So these are some things that if an individual has, it puts them at risk for being a youth at risk, a youth that will ultimately bump into violence. Number 1 is ADHD, hyperactivity, conduct disorder, right? So we're talking about mental health issues that will ultimately create greater risk. Right? The person who has an inability, it's not that they don't know what's right. They have an inability to put it into action. I often tell my clients who struggle with ADHD, say, it's like your brain has the engine of a Ferrari, but the brakes of a broken bicycle, right? You have, at this stage, a tremendous amount of impulse that can lead to violence. Early involvement in alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. Low intelligence and educational achievement. Low commitment to school and school failure. This is where you find a tremendous amount of dropouts. So the 5-year-olds who didn't want to go to school because they couldn't read and write and were not progressing like the other students, at age 15, you can't force them anymore. And this is where you have a huge rise in delinquency. If you'll recall last week, we talked about the 5 different areas that need to be targeted to change society, education being one of them, unemployment, involvement in crime, and exposure to violence in the family. Chances are if somebody grew up with violence, unfortunately, it makes them have a tendency to be more violent, to be involved in more violence. So that's individual factors. Risk factors within close relationships, so families, friends, intimate partners, and peers. Poor monitoring and supervision of children by parents who are just not involved. If you recall, Erickson's first stage, which is infancy, there's another theorist named Bowlby and Ainsworth who've developed what's known as the theory of attachment, which is how parents or caregivers take care of infants will ultimately demonstrate what they turn out to be. So for example, you have secure attachment. Child cries, baby cries, parents respond effectively, right? Child has needs, parents fill those needs. Child learns, I have dependable people, and they are attached securely. Unfortunately, very often you'll have parents who are absent, whether it's they themselves are struggling with mental health issues, with some kind of, once read a horrible story. There was a woman in Texas who had gone to buy some drugs and had forgotten that she left her 2 children in the car. And only a day and a half later did she unfortunately find that her children were in the car locked in 100 degrees in the summer and they had died, right? So very often you'll find that when the parents are incapable of taking care of the children, the attachment is unhealthy. Sometimes they know they could depend on the adult in their life, and sometimes the adult in their life is really not dependable. Unfortunately, you have worse. Sometimes the adult or the caregiver in their life is detrimental. They're the ones who are neglectful. They're the ones who are abusive. And often the child will learn to be avoidant. Now, this doesn't only play itself out with a 3-month-old, but at youth, this is where you'll find a tremendous amount of violence and inability to connect normally with society. Harsh, lax, or inconsistent parental disciplinary practices. Again, the ambivalence of, I love you, I hate you, I don't know how to deal with you, I'm sometimes there. A low level of attachment between parents and children. Low parental involvement in children's activities. Parental substance abuse or criminality. I recently spoke to somebody who just got out of rehab. 38-year-old just got out of rehab for alcohol addiction. And I said, when did this start? And they said, when did it start? When I was born. I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, my grandfather was a drunk. My father was a drunk. We come from a family of drunks. He said, we have pictures of me as young as 1 year old drinking beer out of my grandpa's lap, right? We're talking about systemic issues that, problems don't go away. They just continue growing unless we actively take care of them. So parental depression, low family income, right? There are parents who are good working people who, unfortunately, we once lived behind a daycare. And the daycare opened at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they closed at 7 o'clock at night. And I remember in the winter months where the parents would come, it's pitch black, San Diego cold. It's not freezing, but it's cold. And they drop off the kids in their pajamas, and I'd hear the babies crying. And they wouldn't come pick them up until 7 o'clock where the kids are just about ready for bed again. And I'm not judging these parents. There are people who have to work overtime so that they can put bread on their table. But ultimately, there's a price that's paid in the development of the children. Unemployment in the family. Associating with delinquent peers and or gang membership. It is very likely that the people you will be involved with, ultimately, and especially at this age, will influence the things you do. This youth age is a transitional stage. Parents go from being God to, who are you? And friends become the new God. Trends become the new thing to follow. And very often, even the individuals who didn't necessarily start off wanting to do bad will get swept away with the crowd. The last one is risk factors within the community and wider society. So here you have access to and misuse of alcohol, right? Access to and misuse of firearms. Gangs and local supply of illicit drugs. High income inequality. I recently saw a mom who had unfortunately lost her son to overdose. And she had shared that this was during the pandemic. So this happened out here in LA just a couple of months ago. She said her 15-year-old son seemed absolutely fine. He was the most charming individual that they knew, never fought with the family, never. Turns out that on one of the social media avenues, there had been an entire group that was connected with outside drug dealers, and we're getting, during pandemic, during close down, when she could promise the child never left his premises, somehow he was getting hold of drugs that ultimately killed him. And she was talking to parents and saying, you have to be in touch with the realities of the world. The access that exists today is that much easier than, everybody used to always be able to do bad things. That's the bottom line. Evil is not new. And it's always interesting when people attack the cell phones and the internet and those are just devices that you can either do awesome things with or you can do awful things with. Those are choices. We happen to live in a world, though, that those choices are a lot easier today. You often don't need to leave the comfort of your own home to make really bad decisions. And then we have laws, obviously. Now, I'm not going to talk politics, but I know in the United States, laws are always a hot topic of, should we have stricter control? Should we have less control? Is it the person who kills? Is it the gun that kills? Is it the access? But ultimately, the laws of a society will very much dictate what happens during this youth period, right? What is the crackdown of when we do catch somebody selling drugs? What happens when somebody molests another human being? What happens to rapists? What happens to murderers, right? Based on what society does, it will either act as a deterrent or allow for this to manifest. Now, I have over here, in Yiddish, there's an expression. They say, just like things happen in the non-Jewish world, things happen in the Jewish world, right? Which is accurate. Human problems will go across the board. It's just a matter of how we deal with them. And here I want to show you two very significantly different approaches of how youth at risk are dealt with in two very different communities. So if you turn to page 2, this is research that's been published by the Yediot Achronot. I unfortunately cannot find the original article, though I have reached out to Dr. Shlomi, who has written this, and I hope that once I get the original text from him, I'll be able to send it out to you as a primary source. So this article was written by Sophia Hirschfeld, and it's paraphrasing the research of Dr. Shlomi Doron. Dr. Shlomi Doron is a professor at a Michlala in Ashkelon, and he does some fascinating research. He doesn't have a lot online, But from what he does have, it's definitely worth looking into. For example, he has a very interesting article on a comparative analysis between chozrei b'teshuvah, right? People who, what we would dub the balei teshuvah, and chozrei b'she'elah, people who go the opposite direction. And what does it look like? What are the similarities? What are the differences? What are the things they need to relearn to transition? So here he went and did some research on the phenomenon of, and if you look at source 2, Mechkar lama charedim mitablim al ben shechazar b'she'elah. Why do you find that in the Orthodox community, when a child absconds, abandons the path of Torah and mitzvot, the child sits shiva? Yeah, why do they mourn on that child? If you look at the bold, כשילד במשפחה חרדית, אשכנזית. Now it's important, that word, and I'll share with you in a minute why. He says, when you find a religious Ashkenaz family, the child decides this path doesn't work for him. These rules don't work. Theologically, it doesn't make sense. Personally, it doesn't make sense. מחליט לעזוב את הדת, so he decides to leave religion. הוא עלול למות מזה. He literally puts his life at risk. לעתים, at times, כשהוא יתחיל את חייו בעולם החילוני, when he starts his life in, for lack of a better word, the secular world, הוריו יקרו את בגדם, his parents are going to rip their clothing, וישבו עליו shiva, and they'll sit shiva, they'll start mourning. So let's look at what happens here. He has a case of, and I have to understand, Shlomi is doing research contemporarily. So he said, unfortunately, there's no records, right? We're talking about when did this practice start in Ashkenaz of children leaving the fold, so we sit shiva. We obviously have accounts here and there of different families, from Rabbi Akiva Eger to Rabbi Israel Salant. There are anecdotal evidence that this is a practice that's happened quite a while ago. But what he's done is he's interviewed 200 participants and families on what happens when a child leaves the fold, right? Today they have a word for it, they call it OTD, which means off the derech, which is so wrong in so many ways, but the presumption of they've left the path, not a path or our path or the crooked path, but they've left the with a capital T, right? So what happens? And here we have the response of 200 individuals and what it looks like. So here you have a case where there's a guy named Yitzchak. Yitzchak is 21 years old, and for whatever reason, he decides he's leaving. He goes, he moves out, rents himself an apartment, changes the way he dresses, throws away the religious elements, and he's transitioning to a new life. If you look at, again, source to the right side, the third paragraph that's bolded, מחקר של האנתרופולוג דוקטור שלומי דורון מהמכללה האקדמית אשקלון בדק לראשונה את תופעת האבלות בחברה החרדית. So this is the first research that we have on what is this phenomenon of mourning. על חוזרים בשאלה וגילה, so he finds שהתגובה הזו נפוצה רק בחברה החרדית אשכנזית. So he went out to figure out what is this mourning process that goes on when a child or a youth or an individual leaves the community. And he found something very interesting, that this is a phenomenon specific to the Haredi, the religious Orthodox Ashkenazi community. ושיותר מאשר היא מביעה אבל, and more than it's a sign of actual mourning, of grieving, of a loss, על היוצא בשאלה, on the fact that here's a child, right? And think about it from a parent's perspective. A parent raised a child in what they thought was the most golden path for them. And here's the child saying, no, whatever you've taught me, I reject. Whatever you've given me, I don't want. The views and the values that you've tried instilling in me for years, they're not mine, right? So here you have, though, it's not that they're mourning the loss of the child. היא נועדה להציל את האחים של הבן, או הבן הסוררים. Now, I believe it should have said bat, but the article says ben, so I left it intact. He says, more than the phenomenon of mourning is that the child has left the path, it's really just signaling. Are you familiar with the word signaling? Yes? Okay, you have a lot of this now during COVID, and I'll give you an example. We call it virtue signaling, right? Where, for example, there's somebody driving in their own car, the windows are totally shuttered, there's nobody else in the car, and they're wearing double masks, right? It's a form of virtue signaling. It has nothing to do with reality as much as I'm sharing my perspective with you on how I think things have to be and things need to be done. Signaling is we do things as society. I recently spoke to somebody, he said, you know, I drive a car that's twice my mortgage and I don't even care for the car, but I need the car so that my other community members know who I am. So my car is not just to drive, it's actually, I'm signaling something to the community. Another conversation for another time of the pathology in that. So he says more than they're actually mourning the individual, it's signaling to the community, להציל את האחים של הבן או הבת המסורים, כך שסיכוי השידוך שלהם לא ייפגע. Why are we sitting Shiva? Why are we being so demonstrative? So that the individual who left the community doesn't forfeit the chances of their siblings ever getting married. So that the community gets a very clear message, whose side is this family really on? Whose values do they really have? If that doesn't scare you, I don't know what will. You look down, so what happens? We know that in Judaism, we really don't have such a concept, okay? At least in normative Judaism, there's no such concept of sitting on Shiva al Adam Chai, on a human being that's alive, that's living. We don't have that phenomenon. Now, yes, later on, we have in the 1700s, 1800s, a relatively new phenomenon where people are becoming maskilim, going out. This is where you have a start of families not just cutting off the individual, but pretending the person is actually dead. For example, one of the most famous cases is with Yisrael Segal. Anybody familiar with that case? No. Okay, so Yisrael Segal, I believe, was born in the Shaar Chesed neighborhood in Jerusalem to actually a religious Zionist family, okay? Grew up religious Zionist, eventually followed the footsteps of his older brother, Rabbi Don Segal, who is a pretty famous Rosh Yeshiva in the Lithuanian community. He follows him to Panovich, and he goes, he learns. Ultimately, he decides to leave, and he becomes an extremely famous journalist in Israel. When he leaves, again, the fold, his family sits Shiva. And when he dies years later on Sukkot, there's a famous teshuvah, and I will spare the embarrassment of the one who gave that teshuvah. But one of the foremost Lithuanian leaders was asked by Rav Dan Segal and his family, should we sit Shiva? Now that he actually died, he passed away, should we sit Shiva? Now, the fact that that question exists should indicate something very sick about the society that breeds such questions. I don't need to ask anybody if I should love my child. You understand? If that's something you have to ask, that's an indicator of a very bigger ill that we're not going to deal with today. The worst part is the answer is no, you should not sit Shiva, because he already died. Today, only his body died, but he already died as soon as he decided to go out what they call the Tarbut Ra, the evil path. You already sat Shiva. This person's been dead for years. Doesn't matter how many commentators loved him in Israel. Doesn't matter how much influence he's had on the shape and development of society. That's irrelevant. He's been dead. And ultimately, the family did not sit Shiva. So you find over here, Batkufam, in the fourth paragraph by the bold. בתקופה המודרנית, in the more modern times, האדם הראשון שהתפרסם שישבו עליו שבעה בחייו הוא העיתונאי ישראל סגל. Right? So he says, this is the story שנולד למשפחה חרדית בירושלים וחזר בשאלה. So you have here one of the most classic stories where child or young individual, because he wasn't a child, decides to leave the path of his family and they sit Shiva. Now, if you look at the next paragraph, there are three different ways that the families, right? There are three levels of kashrut. So we're talking about the super mahadrin, then the okay, and the they're just faking it, right? So you thought there was only competition in how long your skirt has to be, and how big your beard has to be, and what kind of kosher you don't and don't eat. Even when it comes to mourning on the children that have left the fold, there are three different categories. Okay, so if you look at paragraph, the second to the bottom, ראיינתי כ-200 חוזרים בשאלה. Right, I interviewed about 200 individuals who left the religious community. ואני יכול להגיד שהמילים מוות וקריאה, and I can testify that the words death, rending of the garments, היא קיימת אצל כולם. This is not an isolated case. Right, the community always likes to say, no, it's not true. It was just one crazy individual. Don't believe their testimony. You have 200 individuals who've all shared a very similar, if not same, experience. מי שעוזב את העולם החרדי יודע שזה סוג של מוות. Anybody who's left the fold knows that there's a certain amount of death. Now, this is obviously not exclusive to leaving the Haredi community. Anybody that transitions to something that's different than where they were will experience a loss of, there's a chapter, there's a book that's being closed, and there's a new journey. So what happens? We have three different levels of Shiva. The first one is Hatipus Hashalem, right? This is the whole package. This is like premium. So these people literally will sit Shiva, cover up the mirrors, rip their garments, not shower for 7 days, then observe the 7 days, the 30 days, and literally mourn for a year. You then have Hatipus HaChelki, right, the in-between, which is HaMifsah Chelkit et Minhagei Avelut. They'll take on some of the mourning, but not everything. And then the third one, which is, this is like on the fringe. They're almost going off with their own children, right? Hatipus HaRek, they absorb some signs of mourning, but nothing really significant. They found, if you look at column 2, Gila Doron. So Doron finds in his research, Ki HaMishpachot yoshvot Shiva bikar al Rabbanim. They mostly sit Shiva on their sons. Ach v'lo rak, he says, but obviously not only. V'chen lamed derech lachzor l'chaim, gam im hu chozer b'teshuvah. Now he asks a question. Death is final. Death is literally, it's the end. Yeah. Is there no way of return? What happens if the child does teshuvah? What happens if the child comes back? And he says something fascinating. See, he was invited to a family he doesn't know this, but when he walks in, he sees them sitting Shiva. And he feels super uncomfortable because he didn't realize he was coming at such an intimate moment. And he turns to the family. And if you look at paragraph 3 on the left column, he says, Lo evanti, lama uzmanti bizman Shiva. I couldn't for the life of me understand why was I invited during the mourning period. He thought he was coming to interview them. He didn't realize he's coming the week of Shiva. Niskar achoker. Sha'alti otam, so I asked them, Im ze lo mafri alehem she'igati b'Shiva. Does it not bother you that I'm coming when you're literally in the process of mourning? Lo aleinu v'lo aleichem. When people go through a death, we know the first 3 days the person's not even capable of meeting other people, let alone speaking, hosting, right? This is the most traumatic time period. And here they're hosting him. Vehem hishivu, and they look at him and they say, Sha'ben hatze'ir shalhem azav et ha'olam ha'charidi v'itgayes l'tzava. Lo aleinu, this should never happen to you. His child left the fold of the Orthodox community and he joined the army. He only joined the army just like David HaMelech and all of his army. But v'lachen, and therefore, hem nimtzaim bereshit halich ha'avelut. They're at the initial phases of the journey of mourning. Kibalti helem muchlat. He said, I was so shocked myself. Now listen to what shocked him the most. Lo hikarti et tova. I've never bumped into such a phenomenon. Meolam lo yashafti mul abba ve'ima. I've never sat across two parents. Shedibru b'tzura kol kach rationalit. They're speaking to me from almost the most apathetic, rational place. Al kach she'aben shelem met. They're telling me their son died. They're explaining to me why he died, right? How he died on the altar of national service and joining the army so he could protect the country. He said, and I'm standing here in shock. They're talking to me almost like this is something so normal. Afilu lo yadati ma lishol. He said, I was so shocked, I was tongue-tied. I didn't even have anything to ask them. HaMishpacha lo ba lehalevaya. So he says, what happens here? How does this process work? So interestingly enough, unfortunately, when lo aleinu, there's real death. So people know when is the time of death, when the person died. Over here, because the person didn't really die, they base it off what we call the shmuah of death. When was the family notified of the death? So God forbid if somebody didn't actually see the death, but it came to them as a message, what would that look like? So they go to the Rav, right? They go to the rabbi of the community. And this is the process. At first, when they see the child who's at risk, right, no longer wants to go to the Beit Knesset, no longer wants to wear the same clothing, eat the same foods, they try what's known as a rehabilitation process, right? Let's get them back into the fold. If that doesn't work, they send them to some kind of like a rehab, but not actually a rehab that's been produced by the community to make sure that the child or individual fits back into the box. This is not a rehab, right? This is not a rehabilitation process of why is the individual leaving, what's bothering them, as much as how do we get them back? When they get to the stage where they know, hold on, this is a point of no return, that's when the rabbi will say, okay, starting now, this is when the child died. And if it's now, what time is it, 9 o'clock? Okay, so 9 o'clock, this is when you're going to be kovea. This is when you're going to ascertain on the death certificate. Yitzchak, 21 years old, died at 9 o'clock. This is when the family starts to observe Shiva. Even as I speak it, it makes so little sense to me because it is so absurd. And yet we're talking about something that is happening as you and I speak. You don't have to believe me. Just go onto Facebook and try to join a couple of groups that will give you a little more information of what goes on when somebody tries to leave. So look at the second to last paragraph on page 2 on the left side. Chashafti, he said, I thought שאני עומד לפגוש מגזרים קיצוניים. I thought I'm going to meet like the crazy radicals, right? When I'm sharing with you, of course, it's the fringe people, it's the nut jobs. זה לא התקבל על דעתי שהורים מחליטים לשבת שבעה לבן החי שלהם. He said, I can't fathom, and I couldn't fathom, that parents would sit shiva on their children who are still alive. אבל גיליתי שזה חוצה מגזרים. He said, but very quickly I realized these are not fringe things. These are not isolated incidents. This isn't a one-off that has happened. Litayim, the Hasidim, right? This crosses all the boundaries. You could be of Lithuanian descent, you could be of Hasidic descent. נתקלתי במשפחות נורמטיביות שפועלות כך. I found normal families. I wasn't looking at crazy, right? We're looking at families that are considered mainstream, considered normal, are not considered fringe, and these are the practices that they're doing. חיפשתי סריטות. I was looking for, there's got to be some story here. There's got to be some kind of blemish that I could say, oh, this was it. אבל לא מצאתי, I didn't find. מה שכן, but what I did find, התברר שזה קיים רק אצל משפחות אשכנזיות. He said, but something interesting I did find, across the board, this only happened in families of Ashkenaz descent. Now, a different conversation for a different time about culture and how families develop and what families do and don't mean. Not often what the West decides is right and correct and proper is necessarily what's normal, healthy, and functioning. I'm going to leave it at that because it's something very sensitive. But he says, אצל הספרדים יש יותר חשיבות למשפחה. We know that culturally, Sfaradim, and I believe it's not just culturally, but theologically, philosophically, right? It's not, I hate when people say, oh, it's because Sfaradim have such warm hearts. This has nothing to do with our warm hearts and lack of brains. This is a very intentional attitude we have towards human beings, specifically those who are related to us by blood. Yeah. The ability for a person to have a family member that they don't talk to for 20, 30 years, I don't know, if that's progress, then I'd rather go back to what the cavemen were doing. Because beating each other up and then sitting down for tea makes a lot more sense, right? He says, we find that ספרדים יש יותר חשיבות למשפחה מאשר לחברת הלומדים או למסגרת הקהילתית. He says, interestingly enough, the Ashkenaz community think the need for the individuals to match the community is much stronger than in the Sephardic community of we need to be like them. Now I wonder, and this would obviously be a different research, what happens to Sfaradim who dress up and try to mit Ashkenazim? I wonder if that phenomenon unfortunately changes along with the costume and everything else that goes with it. I don't know. Another research project. But he says something fascinating. If you look at page 3, this phenomenon, so we have the different categories. Some people sit more shiva, less severe. But the point of it is really not mourning the child. The purpose of it is to protect the family, right? To protect the siblings. So here's one child who, 23 years old, picked up and decided to join the Israeli army, but now he has 15 younger siblings who are never going to get married, who won't have schools to go to, who are going to be thrown out of the community. And the parents, in an attempt to save their family, has to let one go. I once had a conversation with somebody who is related to me that lives on a different coast. And I said to them, what are you going to do with a child that's not like you? What are you going to do with a child that starts challenging you, starts poking holes, starts rebelling in the most healthy fashion? So the individual said, well, that's when I'll send them to you. I said, oh, okay, at least we're good for something. I said, but it's your child. And the individual said, yeah, that's why we have a lot of them. That's why we have a lot of them. So 1 or 2 are going to end up in your side of the camp. What could I do? But it's mind-boggling. I once spoke to, again, another individual on the other side, and they told me that their child was, let's put it this way. Their child was being hurt in school in a way that is unacceptable. And I said, are you going to speak to the principal? She said, no. I said, are you going to do something? She said, what do you want me to do? I have 5 other kids in this school. If I will come and speak to the principal, not just that one child, all my children are going to be thrown out of the school. And the other schools are going to very quickly get the memo, you don't want this parent, because this parent makes problems. So what could I do that for the benefit, the greater benefit of my children, I have to make sacrifices? Obviously, my question is, if you live in a community that you have to make sacrifices of your children, that should make you question why you're part of such a community to begin with. Yes? If you look at paragraph 1, 2, 3, Doron mesaper המקרא נוסף של בחור מבני ברק. So this is another story. Not Yitzchak, not the one who went to the army, not Yisrael Segal. Another, שמשפחתו ישבה עליו 7 ו4 שנים אחר כך. Horrible story. He left the community, right? Parents did shiva. They mourn for him. A couple of years later, 4 years later, he contracts cancer. And he's going through horrible treatment, suffering, and ultimately dies. What happens? Uvnei mishpacha klal lo ba'u. You know who comes to his funeral? The friends that he hung out with, the people that he lived with. His family isn't present because to them he had died 6 years ago when he left. What does the cancer have to do with anything? So here's a very interesting act where the child is notified. You are officially going to be erased from the community. And the signal is, we're going to erase your phone from the phone number, so you don't exist. I have no way of contacting you. You have no way of contacting me. You're a nobody to me. Right? It's more than just I unfriended you from Facebook. It's I've obliterated you from our family. Look at the second paragraph on the right, second from the bottom. When the child, the individual who leaves the community hears, oh, it's the time of our hearing, right? He already knows exactly what's being spoken about. Omer Doron. This is, think about the psychological impact of an individual saying, the people you love, the people you hate, the people you've known for your entire life, you're dead. You are now dead. The shmuah, right? The hearing of, through the rabbi, this person is officially dead. It's been told to your parents. It's over. He said, interestingly enough, I thought that the child would go through some severe breakdown at this point. He said, he doesn't. He assumes that a child who leaves the Orthodox world already knows what the price tag is to leave, simply because it's been demonstrated before. It's the cousin, it's the uncle, it's the aunt, it's the nephew, it's the neighbor. Everybody knows what happens. So when you choose to leave, you know the inevitable will happen. They go through a different mourning process. They have already started the process of mourning a life that they thought was, of mourning a life that never will be, of relationships that may or may never exist, of figuring out who they are now, stepping out of their own boundaries. They've already started their own mourning process, and there's almost a relief when the family not just sits shiva, but recognizes it. It's not them now battling inward. It's now official. The whole community knows. This is no longer in the privacy of home, in the office of therapists who are trying to convert them back to their path, right? This is no longer a private issue. And there's a certain sense of relief to know, that's it. I've walked out, and they acknowledge that. Avalama. Look at paragraph on page 3, the left side. L'chora en b'zeh shum hegayon. He says, why is this the case? We're looking at a phenomenon of people at risk who are choosing differently than the community they come from, and the response of the community is, you're dead. To us, you're dead. You don't exist. He says, why? L'chora en b'zeh shum hegayon. It seems not to have any kind of any explainable answer to it. Wouldn't it be enough just, okay, so cut yourself off from the child? Why do you have to do this whole procedure, right? If you want to be estranged, just don't answer the phone, right? There's a very easy, change your locks. There's a really easy way to cut people out of your lives. If you don't know how to do it, ask your friend. I'm sure they know. Right? Why this whole procedure? Why this process? He says, the sitting shiva, the mourning, is really not a personal response, okay? The families who feel that their children are leaving, they're struggling, that are really hurting both them and the family, are not sitting shiva because they're mourning the loss of the child. Ultimately, they're signaling to the community, we agree with you that in order for us to still be here, we're going to have to let one of us go. And the action of Shiva doesn't tell you so much about the parents' feelings or the siblings' feelings, as much as the communal's force of making sure that those who leave don't come back. And those who are in don't ever think of leaving, because the price you pay for leaving is death. Now, this is a fascinating piece of research, which obviously there are many facets to it. I found the Jewish Observer, right, which is the Aguda newsletter that's been put out for years and years. I don't know if it's still current, but this is from 1999. So we'll see in a minute. We're going to talk about Rav Kapach's essay and how he deals with youth at risk. But here, he deals with it in the 60s and 70s. This is about 30 years later. The Jewish Observer has an entire edition on at youth risk, which you can find online. So if you look at the article at the bottom where the bold is, so they talk about you have a child, a guide to therapy, right? Helping the at-risk child. The experienced Torah observant, I'm on the next page, therapist, will naturally reject the above false understanding. Oh, sorry. Let's look back for a second. Let's look at page 3 on the bottom. Stories abound of secular and non-Jewish therapists incorrectly interpreting the teenager's struggles as being a natural life transition. Right, so we talked about Erickson, about life changes, the natural progression, and actually encouraging the teenager's behavior and the parents and community to learn to accept it. Rachmana litzlan. Could you imagine? People were given the audacity to think. People are giving the teenagers the ability to use their free will, to exercise their own individuality. How dare they? How dangerous is it when you meet a therapist who listens to the individual? I obviously say this in mockery. Right? How dangerous is it to let people think? And at the bottom he says, so that's why their whole push is we need to send to therapists who are tied to Dat Torah, right, to the higher echelons of the community, so that the experienced Torah, and I'm on the next page, observant therapists will naturally reject the above false understanding of the teenager's struggles. Obviously blame the teenager. Obviously don't listen to the teenager. Obviously push the teenager back and make sure that it doesn't reflect on the community, right? And that's why we need to have therapists who work for the rabbis. In my values and ethics course that I teach in social work, one of the topics we talk about is the danger of the blurring of lines and the unethical behavior that happens when professions always have to meet and collaborate. That's what interdisciplinary teams are. But when one profession is used as a front for another tactic, that's just called missionizing. And that's really dangerous. But I want to look at what happens when we have a rabbi who weighs in from a balanced perspective on the exact same issue. So we have here a piece from Rabbi Yosef Qafih, who is a rabbi in Israel, most profoundly known for his work on the Rambam. For those of you unfamiliar, you're more than welcome to go to Shiviti.com. You will find about 51 introductions on Rabbi Yosef Qafih. Suffice it to say that if you Google Rabbi Yosef Qafih, you'll see some videos, not many, but the way he sits, at his desk, wearing a sweater, writing. You would never know how great he is. You would never know that this is the most brilliant scholar who understood what Torah was, understood how it needed to be transmitted, understood the dangers of conventional, and I would say modern, innovations in the Torah. And you look at it, this personality, it's something that is really worth the time to look into. So here's a letter that he is responding to. Now, interestingly enough, whenever he would respond to his letters, he would erase all the accolades. So people would write to him, rabbi, grand rabbi, all the titles. When he would respond, he would just erase them. It's not about me. They say when he would answer his phone, he would say, Shalom, Mishpachat Kapach miYerushalayim. Hi, welcome to the residents of the Kapach family. Meaning, it's a litmus test. When people are great, they have no need to be they don't have the need to then show off their greatness. And you find over here, Moshe anav mikol adam, right, the greatest compliment. I believe Rabbi Yosef Qafih, anav mikol adam, and yet was bold as a lion when it came to being midayek. So here he gets a letter about, we have youth. Now we're talking about in the 60s and 70s in Israel. Okay, so in the 60s and 70s, there's a letter sent him by a religious youth leader who says, we have a problem of kids at risk. right? We have youth at risk. We have people who are on the streets. They're doing drugs. They're drinking. They're being sexually promiscuous. What do we do with them? There are options in the kibbutzim where we can send them so they can get rehabilitated. They have facilities that are set up where they can take care of our youth. But these are kibbutzim. This is not people who don't believe. These are people who believe that you should never believe and we should bury everything that's religious. What do we do with these children? Are we allowed to send them? Are we allowed to offer them this alternative? And I want to look at the teshuvah with you. If you look at page 4, Kenar Shalom, he says, in response to your question, he says, in response to your question of can a religious youth leader advise the individual, why don't you go to that kibbutz? They have a really good rehab. They have a really good integration program. They have a really good transitional program that you will benefit from. Are they allowed to advise them to go there? He says, Hashela sibucham on the second paragraph. Hashela sibucham b'miktzat. It's a complicated question. He says, there's no simple, easy solution. Because every solution, there are cons to it. And he says, therefore, he said, this is a very complicated, sensitive issue. And every solution really has a lot of cons to it. And all the cons also have pros. So I'm going to bring more than just the simple answer to your question, but I'm going to bring context. He said, and we're going to have to pick the path of least resistance, right? Sometimes you're not, the choice between good and evil is easy. Choosing between good and better, bad and worse, that's much more difficult. So let's look at what's the problem. He said, before we could even talk about the pros and cons, let's try to put ourselves in the youth's shoes. You hear those words? Before we're going to judge what's good for you, why don't we for a second try to understand you? Why don't we try to understand what's driving you? He says, let's try to imagine the person and the struggle they're going through like it is. Before you're going to start deciding life and death for another human being, before you're going to decide, should we throw them out of the community? Should we rehabilitate them? Should we take their number and cross? Why don't you put yourself in their shoes for just a few minutes? Try to understand what is driving this individual. He says, look at this next paragraph. He says, you're looking at somebody who's angry. Somebody who, for whatever reason, these are people who are struggling. They wake up in the morning, they're depressed, they're angry, they're sad, they're worried. And who do they blame? Society. They're looking at society and saying, you are the cause of all my problems. We're in this horrible state of being, and you are the cause of it. And they feel a certain amount of anger. I need to get back at you, right? You've hurt me in ways that, whether they're imaginable or real, I feel you did me wrong. And as such, I want to take revenge. There's a fascinating book written by one of my professors. His name is Dr. Jonathan Fast. It's called Ceremonial Violence, which has a prequel called Beyond Bullying. And he's done research on all the school shootings that have happened in the United States. And there's one common thread. Okay? Those who have gone out to actively shoot have all felt that society has done them wrong and has bullied them and victimized them in a way that they want revenge. Some of them, yes, they also want to go down. But all of them were seeking revenge for the injustice that society has done to them, perceived, imagined, or real. He says, Yeshnam bayamim. Yishenim bayamim. They sleep during the day, mitgodedim baleilot. So what happens? You have these youth who, they sleep until 5, 6 in the afternoon, and then they're up all night partying again, and then they sleep, and they have this horrible, vicious cycle, and somehow their perception is that society at large is the cause of all their disconnect. And what happens? So here they're left lelo Torah, lelo emunah. Notice he differentiates. He says, number one, so they're left obviously absent of their religious life. They're also absent of their belief, their faith. Right? You could have people have Torah and have no faith, and you could have people who have faith and don't have the practical side of Torah. He He says, "V'lo derech eretz," and they have no means of supporting themselves. ולא רק ללא מקצוע שיוכלו להתפרנס ממנו, אלא אף מתוך שנאת המלאכה. It's not like they're a bunch of jobless, unemployed people because they can't work. It's they despise anything that's institutionalized. Anything that to them seems like a threat and danger and against their plan, they hate. So here you have people who are not just unproductive, but they're really harms to society as well as to themselves. So he says, if you picture for a second the pain, the struggle of the individual who's living with this thought, I'm part of a society that hates me, that I hate, that has caused me to suffer so much. He says, now, והנה המציאות, כי מועטם של נערים הללו באו מבתים חילוניים. He says, see, the problem is most of the youth that you're asking for do not come from secular homes. Because if they came from secular homes, of course, I would say send them to the kibbutzim. They're only going to benefit. He said, but most of the children you're talking about, they come from batim misoratim, right? They come from masorti, traditional homes, Sephardic homes like ours. Keep Shabbat, keep kosher, some more, some less, but the traditions are there. We're not talking about a community that is completely disconnected. And if you look at the bottom of 4, ki tov lahem v'tov laberiot tzdur. So he said, for those who grew up in a secular background, obviously it would make perfect sense. Send them to the rehab on the kibbutzim. Ki tov lahem, it's good for them. V'tov laberiot, it's good for society. Sdurim b'kibbutzim chiloniyim. It's good for them to be set up in these programs. Tov laberiot shenimnuim mehem niskei narim halalu. It's good for society to have youth that are dangerous off the street. Just recently, I read in Yeshiva World News. So this is from November 30th, 2021. It says, alert in Flatbush. Youths have stolen numerous vehicles from Brooklyn shuls over Shabbos in recent months. Right? We're talking about current events, where a disturbing phenomenon has been taking place in Flatbush over the past several months, in which a group of teenagers have been breaking into shuls on Friday night. Sadly, these teenagers are members of Frum family Flatbush households. He says, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get the kids off the street. Society will be taken care of. Niskei mamon, the damages, monetary damages, he said, you'll also make sure that not only do they not harm society, but they don't engage with other youths and influence them. And how often is it that you have somebody who's been on a good track and then bad friends bring them down? He says, so for them, the solution is perfect. He said, what about the child who grows up in a masorti home, who maybe, they kept Shabbat, they kept kosher, and now we're going to send them to kibbutz, where beforehand they may, even if they didn't keep kosher, they didn't keep Shabbat, they didn't keep Torah mitzvot, it came from a childish, mischievous side. So now we're going to send them to people who decidedly want to uproot their religion and implant new ideas. He said, what about the few youth who maybe left alone, they would actually return? Maybe they would come back. Yeah, they do their stint from 12 to 15, from 12 to 20, and they would come back. And here we're sending them to a place where for sure the values, the morals, and the teachings are not going to parallel to those that they come from at home. He said, but the truth is, I don't have so much hope. Because even for those few who actually do end up coming back, who do end up leaving their path, who are no longer at risk, he said that number is so little that it's unfair to make the calculation not to send the majority because of the minority who would actually come home. Now, it's very interesting in Chacham Tzvi Zohar's book, where he brings bits and pieces of Rav Kafich's article. He says this article is actually written in the 60s and 70s when the Ir Atika, Yerushalayim, is now becoming a center for like social clubs, right? Now, if you go to the old city, it's a whole different scene today. But we're talking about in the 60s, 70s where there are pubs opening, society is changing, the streets are filling. And Rav Kapach says, who are we to fool ourselves that these youths are keeping kosher? They're anyway going out, they're drinking, they're being sexually promiscuous, they're doing all the things that are harmful to themselves anyway. So look at the bottom of page 4. Sha'ad kol, all the way on the bottom. L'rov rubam shel na'arim halalu, sturim b'kibbutzim. He says, I want you to know, for the majority of these youth, it would be really, really good for them to go to these kibbutzim. Tov ubatuach lahem kimat. Sham, why is it so good for them? He says, Sham yilmedu derech eretz. You know what they're going to learn there? They're going to learn how to be proper citizens of the world. You hear what he said? He didn't say they're going to become bnei yeshiva. They're not putting on hats and jackets and growing beards. The girls aren't suddenly wearing skirts and praying at the kotel 3 times a day. They are going to become functioning, healthy human beings that will contribute to society. Yilmedu la'asok b'mishloach yad mechubad. They'll learn some kind of profession. Hamechalkel otam b'chavod, that they'll be able to sustain themselves. They're not doing drugs on the side of the road. They now have a job. They have a vocation. They have a profession. En limana mikach michshash otam bodedim shesavek. He said there's no reason to hold back the majority who would benefit from it, from the minority who may be negatively impacted. Look at page 5. שיחזרו למוטב מעליהם, והרי חובה אצלנו ללמד את הנער מלאכה, and this is something so critical. Rav Kapach says, our job is to teach the youth מלאכה שיתפרנס ממנה. One of these calculations of can we send children who are at risk from masorti homes to the kibbutzim, where definitely the religion not only won't be pushed, but it will be denigrated. He says, our priority is to make sure that they have a profession, that they become functional members of society, that they don't become unemployed, they don't become poverty-struck. V'kach amru Chazal. He says, and here we find Chazal, and he brings 3 different sources where Chazal tell us, b'chovat ha'av livno, the father's obligation, lilamdo umanut minayin. How do you know that somebody has to teach their son some kind of trade, their children? Amar Chizkiyahu, and Chizkiyahu says, just like you marry a woman, right? Amar kre re'chaim אם אישה אשר אהבת, אם אישה ממשי, כשם שחייב להשיאו, כך חייב ללמדו אומנות. He says, just like you have an obligation to marry a woman, so too you have an obligation to teach your child a trade. עם תורה היא. Just like you have an obligation to learn Torah, כשם שחייב ללמדו תורה, just like the parent has an obligation to teach him Torah, כך חייב ללמדו אומנות. The parent has an obligation to teach his child a profession that is sustainable, that is mechubad, that the person will not be poverty-struck and living off government unemployment and disability for the rest of his life. It's amazing how there's a society that's built around glorification of taking funds from the government and the denigration of getting a job that's mechubad, that pays your bills, that you don't have to take handouts. He says, and he says, we see how much Chazal valued milacha, work. רואים אנו למוד, ועד כדי ששקול בעיניהם לימוד הלכה כלימוד תורה. I want you to go down on the bottom of that paragraph. This is from Sanhedrin. ומחילתא דרשב"י, פרשת יתרו, it says, כשם שנצטוו ישראל על מצוות עשה של שבת, just like the Jewish people have an obligation to rest on Shabbat, to cease from work, נצטוו על המלאכה בששת הימים. We have the same obligation to work 6 days a week. So it's not like we have an obligation, Shabbat, you stop working, and the 6 days of the week, do whatever you want. Just like Shabbat is something you have to keep, so are the 6 days of work something that we have to keep. This is something that it would be wise to plaster all over the walls with the pashkevilin. Reb Kapach says, when we take into account rehabilitation, we have to understand that before we will rehabilitate religiosity, we need to restore humanity. We need to give the youth who is struggling the ability to succeed. You have somebody who's angry, somebody who's hurt, somebody who's suffering, and you're going to be shoving religion down his throat? He said, I'm not telling you I'm not concerned about their religion. I am. Of course I want them to be Shomrei Torah and Mitzvot. But before we can focus on that, we need to rehabilitate the person. What does it help to have somebody who keeps Torah and Mitzvot, but is a broken human being? What do you have? So you have a shattered soul, a shattered body, a shattered mind. Ha'ikal, the person goes to the Bet Knesset. What good is that? Rav Kapach continues. Ad kan mibchinat hanarim halalu. He says, so from the pure benefit of the youth, it's enough of a reason to send them to the kibbutzim, where we know for sure their religion will be harmed, but their humanity will be restored. They will be able to learn a profession. They will be able to sustain themselves. They will get their feet back into society, where they'll be able to re-enter, because the exit and entry aren't closed off, right? We're taking a little scenic detour. These are individuals who it hasn't worked for them up until now. And our job is to understand them. Our job is to meet them where they're at. Our job is to then facilitate within them the growth that they need from where they need it. Not what we've decided to push down their throat. Not with our scare tactics that we've decided, but to be able to figure out what does this human being need. He says more than that. Ad kan mibchinat hanarim. Okay, so this is all the benefit for the youth. Halalu atzmam lachziram lemaslu hachayim hativim, to bring them back to a natural, normal lifestyle. Im lo mibchina yehudit, right? We're not talking about a religious lifestyle. Kamor hare vaday mibchinat enushit. From a humanistic perspective, we will restore them to their life. Lachzir lahem et hatchusha shem chelek mihatzibur. You know what it means for a human being to feel like they're part of society again? That they could walk into a store and they could pay for their own sandwich? That they could sit around the table and their opinion will be valued? That they will be invited to the family events because they're just another part of the family? Here we're talking about people who, for whatever reason, don't feel a part. They feel rejected by society. Rav Kapach says, if we have an ability to rehabilitate them, even if it's not on a religious level, on a humanistic level, of course we'll take that opportunity. התחושה שהם חלק מן הציבור הכללי, הבונה והייצור, שהם חלק מהחברה הטבעית, ולסלק מהם את תחושת הזרות וההתנכרות. Let's help them get the feeling of alienation, of estrangement. Let's get that to disappear. Right? We talked about attachment issues. If we can help people find their identity within, you don't need to lose your individuality to be part of the colorful world that we have. You can be a somebody and not a nobody, and yet still be a part of us. תחושת זרותם לחברה וזרות החברה להם, תחושת התנכרותם לחברה והתנכרות החברה שלהם. If we can help them feel less alienated and open the door for them to come back, so what if the route is more scenic? So what if it's not conventional? So what if it goes against our religious values? If we're going to bring the humanity back, and the individual will know the door's never been closed. You've just gone a different route. He says, but more than that, if you look at, again, left column, second, מבחינת הציבור, you want to know the benefit for the community? The מבחינת הציבור, הגדולה והחשובה היא פעולת סילוקים של הנערים הללו מן הרחוב כדי לסלק נזקיהם, נזקי ממון ורכוש כאמור לעיל. He says, we talked about the individual and what their process of re-entry to the community may or may not look like. A re-entry doesn't mean things go back to the way they were, right? But if we're able to help the individual, of course we should. Rav Kapach says, but you want to know who else is going to benefit? Us. Society will benefit. Remember the statistics I read to you? About the 200,000 homicides that happen a year, right? About the victims of stabbings, of death, of rape and murder. We as society are going to benefit. And he brings the story of the Ben Sorer u'Meorer, right? He says, could you imagine when we find in the Torah, the 13-year-old who we already know is going to be a menace to society. He will create chaos, havoc, destroy society, and ultimately hurt everybody. The Torah says we need to stop him in his tracks. Rav Kapach says here we're not talking about killing the individual. To the contrary, today we have solutions that work. We have the ability to send this individual to places that he will relearn behaviors, patterns, so that us as a community, we're going to benefit. Right? We look at the individual who's struggling, we say it's his problem. What do I care if there are people at risk? I'm not at risk. The answer is, how do you know you're not at risk? Of course you're at risk. Everybody's at risk. Everybody's at risk for something. If we live in a community where we care about the individual, it only makes sense to deal with the individual in the most healthy fashion that works for them. And he ends off, לפיכך, he says, therefore, נראה שאין להימנע מלסדר נערים סוטים בכל מקום שיש סיכויים שיחזרו מאותיו. He says, in summary, to answer your question, should we send the youth, the at-risk individual, to places that will benefit them, even if it may come at the cost of their religion? Yes. מאיזו בחינה שהיא, it doesn't matter. In whatever capacity, send them. ואף בקיבוצים חילוניים, even if it's going to mean sending them to places where we know what their beliefs are and what the antithesis of what we think and they think is. ברשעים מדריכים שומרי תורה ומצוות. And he says, I want you to know the youth leaders, the therapists, the professionals, you should feel confident לפעול למען סידורם כנ"ל, גם לשם מניעת נזקים מציבור. He said, I want you to know you should feel confident that when you're sending these individuals to places that they will get the help they need, it's not just to the benefit of the individual, but it's the benefit of the society. You know, when I read this, part of me hurts. Because you know where I found this? I found it in the Ketavim of Rav Kapach in a book that I don't know when it was printed. I don't know when it's going to be printed again. In my house, we have Chelek Aleph, Chelek Bet. Chelek Gimel is not here. It is. You can find it in Otzer HaChochma. They actually do have a copy of it. But I'm looking at a solution that is so simple, so revolutionary, and yet, he's writing it in the 60s and 70s, and today we know this to be true. This is what every mental health professional worth their salt will tell you to do. Our Chachamim have solutions that are not just cutting edge, but they're in touch with society. They're in touch with the reality. Are they cultural? I don't know. Maybe that's what Dr. Doron has decided. Maybe they're not. Maybe they come from a philosophy. Maybe they come from a theology. Maybe they come from a true understanding of the Torah and what God actually wanted from us. And it makes me sad that it's buried. And it makes me happy because we have a Habura, we have programs, we have shiurim, and it's really our job to look at these letters, to look at the different approaches that we have to people who are struggling and say, well, which side of history am I going to be on? Because I know that I'm going to go with the Chachamim who've dealt with society in ways that says, the ways of Hashem are pleasant. And if it's not Noam, it's not the way of Hashem. If you're being asked to do things that are so irrational to the people that you love, how could it be the way of God? How could it be the way of the Torah? And I'm asking us to study. Everybody has limited amounts of times of what they can study. Study the things that matter. We have gold mines that are hidden. And Baruch Hashem, I believe, this week there were 3 shiurim, on Monday, on Wednesday, and Monday, Wednesday, today. I keep coming back because these are the words that will propel us not just into the future, but will bring Am Yisrael and the rest of the world to a good, healthy place where, as society, we understand how to be individuals and make place for everybody.